families on that whole side of the room. Today my presentation is on representations of family in Chicano English narratives. And I chose to focus on Chicano English narratives in particular for two main reasons. One, I wanted to build a deeper understanding of my own heritage culture. It's something that I've really had to grapple with accepting as part of my identity, because I am fourth generation born in the US, never been to Mexico, and I'm not a native Spanish speaker. So the kids in school like to tell me that I was not Mexican enough, but it's actually thanks to my family that I can decide, yes, I am Chicana enough, because they are my actual connection to my roots. So let's just jump right into it. This presentation is going to mirror the structure of my research paper, so if any of this is interesting to you guys and you want to read more about that, please let me know. I'll send you a copy, or it'll be available on Dr. Litterer's website as well. So the introduction is just going to cover some of the motivations and goals behind this project, and then we'll move over to my research questions, which will introduce a little bit of the terminology guiding this project. And in my background theory, I will cover conceptual metaphor theory, cultural linguistics, and this sociology term of familism that I've kind of adopted and made into a linguistic term. And within the methodology section, I'm going to cover the narratives that I selected as my data sources. I'll go over the criteria for selection and the reasons why I chose them. And in my data presentation, I'm going to show you guys some excerpts from the narratives with quotes, and they will be presented alongside their corresponding conceptual metaphors related to family and their cultural schemas. And in the discussion section, we'll kind of circle back to my research questions, and we'll wrap it all up in the conclusion. So without further ado, there are many more cultures than just Chicano culture that have this special regard of family, but it's really for my own personal interest that I'm using my own culture as my data source. Ideally, this study will be replicated using many other cultures as the focus. And my main goal here is just to connect the idea of family to linguistically detectable cultural conceptualizations. Big words already, but just think of cultural conceptualizations as the value systems that shape a culture. And one of the motivations for this project as well is to just build a background for Chicano English and cognitive linguistics, which studies the relationship between language, the mind, and the human experience. The current research on Chicano English has primarily been just to solidify its status as a stable native dialect. And my project is going to move forward with this already in mind, and we're going to start pulling some cognitive frameworks from this cultural study using conceptual metaphor analysis, which I'll explain in just a second. And Chicano English has also primarily been studied just for the way that it sounds and for the way that it's been articulated. So this just goes a step further with all of that already assumed. All right, so for these research questions, the first one I have is, how is the notion of family metaphorically conceptualized in the Chicano English autobiographical narratives? So we have to anticipate that the conceptual metaphors are going to cover broader English language conceptual frameworks. I'm not saying that there's any specific conceptual metaphors exclusively regarded for Chicano English, but that still moves us on to my second question, because I know that their family has this special connotation within my culture. So I had to ask, how do these metaphorical constructions reflect the cultural conceptualizations of Chicano family values, if they do at all? So I need to connect the overall cognitive frameworks of family to the more meaningful cultural frameworks. All right, so let's start jumping into some background theory. These guys are not my family members like the other pictures. Over here we have George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. They developed this theory back in the 1980s. And to compress it all into one single sentence, which probably doesn't do it enough justice, it just posits that metaphor is a cognitive tool used by humans to understand abstract ideas through concrete physical experiences. So in conceptual metaphor theory, we refer to the abstract ideas as target domains, and we refer to the concrete physical experiences as source domains. So you'll recognize a conceptual metaphor when it takes this format of being in all caps, and we have the organization of the target domain is the source domain. All right, so I know this still doesn't really solidify what conceptual metaphor theory is, so I'm going to use your guys' intuition to help you come to the conclusion of a conceptual metaphor. So I have 4 expressions on the screen. The bottom one's kind of cut off, but we can still read it. So I have the phrase, I'm on cloud 9, I'm over the moon, I'm in high spirits, and I'm on top of the world. So if someone from the audience could just shout out, what basic emotion do you think is being insinuated by these expressions?
Being elevated. Happy.
Yes! Wow, yay, thank you for the participation. So this, in its most basic form, I boiled it down to happiness. The conceptual metaphor that we see here is happiness is up. Now I know none of the expressions stated the word happiness or stated the word up, but we just have these associations underlying in our cognitive frameworks. So to conceptualize it even further, I have a counterexample here of sadness is down with some example expressions like I'm in low spirits or I'm feeling down in the dumps. So how do we know that verticality can even be used as a source domain? Well, we know this because we have in our physical experience of the world, in our bodies, we have the understanding that there are positions of being up and there are positions of being down. We know that birds fly up in the sky and there are worms that go down in the earth. Now those aren't the only two examples of up and down in our physical world, but they paint the picture that we can see with our bodies and our eyes that there is a difference between up and down. And we use that framework, map it over to something that's not physical, like happiness, and it helps us frame our understanding. Now, I love conceptual metaphor theory, and I would love to keep talking about other examples, but we'll circle back to the family metaphors in just a few minutes. But I do need to connect my... So my project is interested in the influence of cultural values of family on family metaphors. So I need some other form of analysis in order to connect these two things. So that's where cultural linguistics comes into play. It originates in the fields of anthropology, sociology, psychology, and of course linguistics, and it's primarily concerned with the features of language that encode culturally constructed conceptualizations of the human experience. And now here's a more formal definition of culturally constructed conceptualizations. It's that they're shared learned mental frameworks that a specific group of people or culture uses to interpret reality, categorize experiences, and to guide our behavior. In my paper, it's going to cover 3 different conceptual processes within cultural conceptualizations, but for the sake of time and for the relevance of my project, I'm only going to cover one that is the most important, and that is cultural schemas. So, cultural schemas, the definition of this is very similar to cultural conceptualizations, but they are shared cultural value systems present in human cognition used to interpret social situations and to guide our behavior. So better described through examples, we have individualistic cultures which have higher values of upfront direct communication, whereas in collectivist cultures, there is more of a value of a deference to authority. So in the experience of both cultures, like Mexican-American culture, sometimes I can come along with this concept of how do I communicate? What do I do? What's the procedure? And that's how I felt kind of growing up and going to school with a more individualistic culture. But at home it was more collectivistic. So trying to navigate these differences in cultures was something that's really important to me in this study. All right, so now we know that cultural, this is my grandparents. Now we know that cultural schemas are, they're shared cultural value systems, and they are used within our human cognition to interpret social situations and to guide behavior. Next, I'm going to boil it down to a more specific family-related cultural schema, and for this I adopt the sociology term familism. And it just describes a set of cultural values that highlight support, respect, loyalty, warmth, closeness, and obligation toward family. In the current sociology research, familism is most commonly linked to Hispanic and Latinx cultures, although it is seen within many other cultures. I think it's just due to the research primarily being on Hispanic or Latinx cultures. But psychologically, in that research, it's been linked to pro-social behavior, well-being, but to show the full end of the spectrum, sometimes it's linked to sadness and distress. All right, but to recap all of the background theory that we've covered so far, we know that conceptual metaphor analysis is going to reveal the family conceptualizations that are accessible to all users of the English language, but the familism cultural schema is going to reveal the value system shaping the interpretation of family experiences within the Chicano narratives, and it's going to add an extended meaning onto the family metaphors that we're about to cover. So, before I get to the data, first I have to ask the questions of how do familism cultural schemas appear within the language data, And how do these features hint at an adjusted meaning to the family conceptual metaphors? Alright, so before we get into the actual data presentation, I have selected 2 different Chicano narratives as my data sources for this study. And the criteria for selection was that they had to be nonfiction autobiographies in the narrative writing form. They had to be written by Chicano or Chicana identifying authors of Mexican-American heritage. And the narrative had to include details on family life. And the first one I selected is shown in the picture here. We have Hoyt Street, an autobiography by Mary Helen Ponce. And this one I selected in particular because of its thematic focus on the family roles within the household and just everyday life and events that occur within a very close-knit family. And my second one is Hunger of Memory. And I selected that one because it has a thematic focus on lost family intimacy due to language barriers. And that one is going to have a little bit more negative connotations, cultural schemas, but again, I want to show the whole end of the spectrum. And then in this project, we are using conceptual metaphor analysis as the primary form of analysis. So this entails the identification of the source and target domains representing family in the text data. And it's going to be presented with metaphor mapping. So you'll see tables that have the source domains on one side and the target domains on the other. And underneath them will be qualities that correspond with each other. And in the cultural linguistic analysis, I'm just going to scan the data for evidence of the familism cultural schema. So expressions that allude to this family value system. And just for you guys to understand the data a little bit better, anything you see underlined is going to reference a familism cultural schema, and anything you see in bold is going to correspond to the family conceptual metaphors. All right, so time to just get right in it. Now, we have, the first one is Hunger of Memory, the education of Richard Rodriguez by the man himself. The primary metaphor used within his study is social groups are physical structures. Now this metaphor alone doesn't signify family as something special or central to the culture, and it can be used in pretty much any other culture as well, the broader English language, and I'm sure in other languages as well. But the mapping I have here to demonstrate it is that the qualities of physical structures that we understand in the physical world are that they have an interior and an exterior. Of course, there's many more qualities to physical structures, but conceptual metaphors don't rely on every single quality of a thing, just enough for you to understand the abstract concept. So we have social groups as corresponding to membership in the social group is the interior of the physical structure, and non-membership in the social group is the exterior of the social structure. So in my little image here, it kind of corresponds to the cultural values that I'm talking about, because the person on the inside of the house is kind of very happy, like, yay, I'm on the inside. And this guy is very sad because he's on the outside. But to show you some of examples of the metaphors in use in actual language, I have things like in the family or outside in the family. That's pretty much going to be the only expression you'll see demonstrating this metaphor, but it tells a story of this whole physical structure concept. And to get a deeper understanding of the cultural schemas, we have the underlying things, like I feel a family member would say something to me and I would feel myself specially recognized, or I would feel embraced by the sounds of their words, or I recognize you as someone special. And these just go to show that these linguistically observed expressions show the attitude toward family regarding a preference for family within the data. And Richard Rodriguez uses 2 additional metaphors within his work on the family structure. First, I'm going to show you this, the mapping. Yeah, got it. Okay, so the first one is intimacy is proximity. When we use this metaphor, we use the word close. Like I could say, I'm close with my sisters. I don't mean that I'm like physically close because we live 300 miles apart, but I mean I'm intimately close with them. So we have something like a nearer proximity is going to correspond to greater or stronger intimacy, and farther proximity is going to correspond to less or weaker intimacy. And for the relationships or physical bonds metaphor, we see that a united bond is going to signify a more mutually strong or intimately connected relationship, and a separated bond is going to correspond to a weak or an estranged kind of relationship. So now that we understand the metaphors, we can look at the data and see how they correspond to the cultural schemas. So in bold, we see things like close association, close intimate bond, separation, things like that. But to signify the values, we have things like, I felt I had somehow committed the sin of betrayal by learning English, or I felt I had shattered the intimate bond that once held the family close. So here we can see that the familism cultural schema evokes the attitudes expressing family betrayal and parental disappointment. And these are things that are expressed as being detrimental to one's sense of identity or closeness with family, because family is so intimately connected with the culture itself. All right, so, but again, this is not representative of every single Chicano family. This is just one experience of a language barrier. So to wrap up the analysis of hunger and memory, we know that these conceptual metaphors are often used together to describe intimate relationships as proximal physical bonds. And when the narrator displays a perceived lack of adherence to the family's cultural schema, the narration develops a sense of sadness and distress. The conceptual metaphor alone does not distinguish family differently than any intimate relationships amongst social groups, but we can see the distinguishing cultural values that are loyalty, closeness, warmth, support, and a sense of respect towards family. All right, moving on to the Hoyt Street data, we see the same dominant conceptual metaphor, which is social groups are physical structures. And again, these are only really represented with expressions like in my family, in our family. So since we understand this one from the last narrative, I'm not going to spend too much time on the data. And Mary Helen Ponce's writing is very literal, so her metaphors occur pretty separately within the narrative from the cultural schemas, so they're going to be shown in separate slides. But regardless, they all tie in together to build upon this one conceptual idea. Okay, so let's just go straight to the example here. We see, this is Mary Helen Ponce talking about her older sister, who was always willing to do more than her share of the housework. She was her mother's right hand, and she would do anything and everything to earn her mother's favor. So this is representative of a pretty good Chicano daughter. But we can see that she builds off the idea that family social groups feed deeper into cultural conceptualizations by highlighting the family member contributions through loyalty, displayed actions of loyalty, obligation, and these ideas as necessary for a respectable family membership. All right, and in the top example, we see talking about the same older sister, Elizabeth fell from grace because she eloped with her husband, and her parents were very disappointed and hurt by her. But this contrasts with the opinions of her other sister, Nora, who was always spending her own money to get things for the family. So there's this sense of admiration that she has towards her sister, who's very generous and puts the family first. And then, though this example is not describing Mary Helen Ponce's opinion about Elizabeth as falling from grace, but it's something that she observes as the truth that her parents are putting out. So this cultural schema hints at the extended meaning to the social group's metaphor. To be recognized warmly by the family, one must be, in a sense, worthy of recognition through displayed action. Okay, so what can we make of all of this data? Let's just circle back to my research questions and see how I did answering them. So how is the notion of family metaphorically conceptualized in Chicano English autobiographical narratives? Well, we see the usage of 3 different conceptual metaphors. Social groups are physical structures, intimacy is proximity, and relationships are physical bonds. But how do these metaphorical constructions reflect the cultural conceptualizations of Chicano family structure? Well, they position family as the central social relationship within the Chicano cultural experience. And they emphasize the sense of emotional closeness, unity, and interpersonal responsibility. So the family metaphors in Chicano narratives draw from broader English language conceptual systems, but these metaphors are intensified by the familism cultural schema. They give values of emotional closeness and interpersonal obligation, and they give the idea that family is, again, central. These findings suggest that conceptual metaphors are shaped by a cultural worldview. So while cultural value systems can add a weight when family relationships are viewed as estranged or not well maintained. They also add this sense of unity and mutual satisfaction when these relationships are well maintained. So to wrap it all up in the conclusion, in sum, my study demonstrates that conceptualizations of family are not culturally neutral. And in Chicano narratives, metaphor becomes a vehicle for linguistic expression of cultural values. And in this study, we have explored that family metaphors reveal how language communicates and preserves cultural values across the lived experiences as they're told through the narratives. So there's an importance in the narratives as a dative source because they're these personal recollections of life, history, and family relationships. So I am calling everyone out in the room to write down your family experiences and try to understand your cultural value systems more so that you can better understand your own families and your own personal value system as well. But these are my references. Thank you all for listening today. Any questions, concerns? Yes.
I want to talk about the term Chicano English.
Oh.
Because you have it in your title, you talked about it a little bit in the start. And you remember, I'm sure, when we read on Zaldúa, How to Tame a Wild Tongue. Do you remember that essay you read?
I remember the title of it.
And you remember how she's writing about living on the borderlands and what it means
Yes.
to speak English and varieties of Spanish that are like specific to where she's from, right?
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, like within the tradition of dialectology, some linguists are trying to say, okay, these features are the features used by Chicano English speakers. But then within sociolinguistics, people say, well, you can't just assume that every Chicano speaker speaks this way, and you can't assume that these features associated with Chicano English are only used by Chicano speakers, right? There's so much more heterogeneity than that. So I guess my question is, like, why call these particular narratives Chicano English narratives? Is there something about the narratives that you think that they're using features that are like emblematic of Chicano English? Or is it that they're Chicano writers and they're writing in English? Like, what prompted the use of that particular phrase, which is loaded for all these reasons?
Yes, it was a very loaded choice to use Chicano English on its own. So, while originally I did have that, like, they're Chicano writers and they're using English to write, but within the narratives, they use instances of like language switching. They'll use some sentences of Spanish as well. And really, I did use the term because they are speaking English and they're Chicano writers, so that's something that I should probably adjust or at least add more information to behind. But, and these ones specifically, let me go to my I use the term because they are connected with these cultural value systems all together. The metaphors, while they can be used by English language speakers of all different varieties, of all different dialects, the Chicano value system really shines through within the particular experiences of the narrative. And I think I just closely associate that cultural identity and those value systems with the particular language choices that they're making in the narratives. Thank you. Any other questions?
I can have a question, but I would prefer if there's a student or a family member in the room who would like to ask. Okay, I just love the integration of the family, literally, into this presentation. I'm wondering about, let's say for a next project, the bilingual potential of your analytic approach. I'm thinking in Spanish, you know, the use of de, like del Prado, del Guzman, you know, de Guzman. You're always of something to signal your affiliation. And I'm wondering, could you imagine doing like a bilingual analysis? What would you be drawn to based on this view on affiliation in so many different manifestations.
Well, I'm sure I would have a lot more to say if I actually spoke Spanish fluently, but your example is perfect. Yeah, being of something and that being shown in all kinds of different expressions where it's not present within English. I'm sure that if I were to study it deeper, that would have some kind of connection to the cultural aspects. But maybe PhD. I would love to go in deeper on that in particular.
I'm actually thinking we could radicalize English by making English speakers start to use the Spanish de, so that we would start changing the way we talk about other family structures. And that sociolinguistic change is possible, as we've seen. Congratulations, what a great presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.